And people were saying, I think with Brexit, I think I read somewhere that, again, it's enough to make you weep really, but the morning after the referendum result, people were Googling, what is the EU?
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. I'm Alice Cohn.
And I'm Casey.
On this episode, we'll be talking about voting systems with Dr. Adam Rieger, Senior Lecturer of University of Glasgow. Here's some thoughts on voting systems.
Today we're talking about voting systems. So shall we start off with Firstpastthepost, since that's probably one that most people are familiar with?
Sure, yes. And I mean, sometimes the way people talk about Firstpastthepost, it's got a kind of iconic status, and some people talk in a way as though, what else could there be? It's sort of unnatural to have anything else. Yes. So maybe the first thing is just to explain what's wrong with Firstpastthepost, and maybe I should make it clear this is not in the context of electing a parliament particularly. So it's I mean, there are separate problems to do with electing a parliament, but even in the simpler problem of just how to elect a single individual, or more generally a single option out of a number of options, it might be, which restaurant to go to in a group of friends or something. But you've got a number of options. You have to choose one, and Firstpastthepost, which of course is the way that we elect MPs to Westminster, is basically you just ask all the voters to vote for their favourite candidate, and the one with the most votes wins. And as I say, it's very natural, and you might almost think, well, how could there be anything else? If you ask, say, a not very imaginative Conservative MP, perhaps somewhere in Surrey, who's come top of the poll with 40% of the vote, maybe the Lib Dem has come second with 35, and Labour's come third with 25 in that constituency. Keep it in England because it's, there are fewer parties, so it's simpler. So it's 40, 35, 25 with the Tory in the lead. And if you say to the Conservative, do you think you should win the election? They'll probably look at you and say, well, of course I should win the election. I mean, how else could it be done? I mean, who are you proposing should win instead of me? I've got the most votes, right? But it's not as simple as that. And all you've got to do really is keep the numbers the same and relabel the options, and then people will start to think, well, hang on a moment, it's not so quick. So let me give you an example from recent history. I mean, the great thing about this bit of theory is that real life keeps coming up with nice illustrative examples. So here's a recent example. About, I suppose, a couple of years ago, there was a sort of impasse with Brexit, and there was a serious suggestion that we should have a three-way referendum to get out of the impasse, with the options as perhaps remain, leave with a deal. So they say leave with Theresa May's deal, as it then was, and leave with no deal. And supposing you hold such a referendum, and Remain comes top with 40%, deal comes second with 35%, and no deal comes third with 25%. And you say to the same Tory MP, let's suppose they're an ardent Brexiteer, you say, well, okay, so by exactly the same logic as you're the winner in your constituency, presumably you now agree that Remain ought to win, and that's the end of Brexit. And they'll probably say at that point, oh, hang on a moment, that's not fair. And the numbers are the same. All you've done is relabel it. So I mean, the moral of this, right, is, well, A, that it's not as simple as you might think, and B, that the reason Firstpastthepost is not the end of the story is actually because, and what's gone wrong in this case is that Remain has won with 40%, but you've got 60% voting for leave options. And so in some sense, you might think, well, the winning option ought to be a leave option. And that might be too quick as well. But anyway, it's the divided opposition problem, right? That if you've got one option representing one super option, if you like, and then you've got the other super option split into a number of possibilities, then you can get what looks like it might be the wrong option coming top, because the opposition to it is just split too many ways.
So it seems like maybe the way around this is that we want to collect more information about voters' preferences. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. So the obvious, and as you say, in a way, it's a separate point, I think, against first past the post, that it's quite crude in terms of what information it collects from the voters. So it only collects the information as to what the first choice is of each voter. So you don't know anything about the second and perhaps lower preferences of the voters if they can't have what they most want. So yeah, I mean, the obvious way to improve on it is to collect people's preferences and ask them not just to put an X in a box, but to rank the candidates or the options. So to put a 1 by their favourite one, a 2 by the next favourite one, and so on. And a lot of people seem to think that that's the main alternative to first past the post, and once you've decided to do rankings, that's the end of the argument. You just do rankings rather than first past the post. But it's not so simple. What people who favour rankings often have in mind is a system called the alternative vote. It's often called instant runoff voting in the US. It's called the alternative vote in the UK. It's the system about which there was a referendum in the UK in 2011, which you probably were too young to remember much of, but it was a very depressing experience for those of us interested in voting theory for various reasons. I mean, one is that first past the post won, and another is that the other option was alternative vote, which is not great either, and the third reason is that the level of debate was enough to make one want to weep. But anyway, the way alternative vote works is that you count the first preferences, and you then if someone's got more than 50%, then great, they've won. If not, then you eliminate the candidate with the fewest number of first preferences. You transfer the votes of all the voters who voted for the losing, the bottom candidate. You transfer all those votes to the second choices of those voters, and then you do it again. You see if anybody's got more than 50% yet, and if they have, then hooray. And if they haven't, then you see who's now in the bottom position and transfer their votes and so on. And then you go on until you're going to come down in the end to 2 candidates if you haven't got one earlier, and then the one with the more votes wins. So that is certainly better than first past the post. Say in the Remain deal, no deal situation, if all the dealers and no dealers are definitely Brexiteers and they'll transfer to each other, if they can't have the leave option they prefer, then it will make one of the leave options win. And so on. So it's definitely an improvement on first past the post, at least as a system for electing a single winner. I mean, it may be actually even worse than first past the post for a parliament, but let's not talk about parliaments at the moment. But it's for single winners, it's a better system, but it's not perfect, I think, anyway.
I think it's interesting how issues arise when perhaps parties don't get the result that they want. And so then they try to manipulate the voting system to get the result that would benefit them. So do you suggest that voting systems benefit one party more than another?
Well, it's a perpetual problem with trying to do anything about reforming voting systems that, and we can only do that through the political system. And of course, the way politicians look at these problems, I mean, the first question they ask is, am I going to lose my seat if we change the system? And the second question they ask is, how is my party going to do if we change the system? And you can see, I mean, historical examples of this, that Labour, in the 80s and 90s, Labour lost 4 elections in a row. I guess the first one was in 79. But in that era, they lost 4 elections in a row. And as they lost more and more elections, they became more and more interested in electoral reform. Because, I mean, one reason that Thatcher was so successful was because the broadly left vote was split between Labour and originally the Alliance, as it was, and then it became the Liberal Democrats. So Labour became very interested in electoral reform, and then of course Blair won this absolutely stonking majority in 1997. So having come to power actually with a commitment to look seriously at electoral reform, it kind of faded away a bit, and of course, it just sort of disappeared. It's very hard to change the constitution without some kind of cross-party agreement, and that's a perpetual problem, I think, with the practicalities of getting any electoral reform. So talk first of all about the alternative vote, because like I say, people talk sometimes as though that's what's in the frame. It's either first past the post or the alternative vote, and that's how the debate seemed in 2011. But that's really not how it seems to people who work in this area. Essentially, the trouble with the alternative vote is, remember what happens is the candidates get eliminated round by round. You start with the one with the fewest number of first preferences, and then you repeat, having done the transfers. But that means to stay in the game, you've got to get some first preferences. And the problem with it is there can be candidates who are basically acceptable to a lot of the electorate, but don't do very well on first preferences. And those candidates will tend to be eliminated early on under the alternative vote. So you can imagine, for example, if you trace numbers in my original example a little bit, so say it's 40 Tory, 35 Labour and 25 Lib Dem. So the centrist candidate is last. That does get eliminated under the alternative vote because they got the smallest number of first preference vote. But you can make a strong case that they ought to win that constituency, because let's say that that they're the second choice of both the Conservatives and the Labour voters. So if they're nobody's last choice and they're everybody's either first or second choice, you can make a strong case that they ought to win. So another way of putting this, there's a thing called the Condorcet criterion, after the Marquis of Condorcet, who was a sort of aristocrat who studied this sort of thing around the time of the French Revolution. But anyway, so what is the Condorcet criterion? It says that you imagine sort of head-to-head contests between the candidates. So imagine temporarily ignore the Lib Dem and pit Conservative against Labour, and then you temporarily ignore the Conservative and pit Lib Dem against Labour, and so on. So you get these sort of head-to-head contests. And the Condorcet criterion says that if there's a candidate that wins all of those head-to-head contests, wins them against all the other options, then that candidate ought to win the election. And the alternative vote does not obey the Condorcet criterion. But for the reason I said that somebody who's a Condorcet winner, it might be the Lib Dem in my example is a Condorcet winner. They're preferred to every other candidate by a majority of the electorate. And nevertheless, they're going to be eliminated in the AV system because they haven't got enough first preferences. I mean, it's not entirely clear. I mean, there are people that think AV is better and you shouldn't elect somebody with not very many first preferences. But I think most theorists think that, on the contrary, that somebody who's a Condorcet winner has a pretty strong case to be the winner in these circumstances.
I was reading a little bit about this and I came across the Condorcet Paradox. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, yeah. So you might think, given where we've got, you might think, well, if you agree with what I've said up to now, the direction I've been heading in, you might say, okay, so that's a better system. Elect the Condorcet winner. So like the Lib Dem in my example. The trouble is, it turns out that there need not be a Condorcet winner. You can have what are called preference cycles. And what does that mean? That means you can have a majority preferring candidate A to candidate B, you can have a majority preferring candidate B to candidate C, and yet a majority prefers candidate C to candidate A. Okay, so it kind of goes around in a circle. It's like scissors, paper, stone, right? And A beats B, B beats C, and C beats A. So there's no Condorcet winner. And this was actually just discovered by Condorcet. It's been discovered various times independently over the history of this industry. Yeah, so that, I mean, this is an example of a general phenomenon that if you try and what we're doing is essentially aggregating preferences. We're trying to sort of combine a number of preferences into a single preference. They don't combine well. So the kind of standard theory in this area is, pick a Condorcet winner if there is one. So if there is a Condorcet winner, there can only be one, then that person's won the election. Great. And if there isn't a Condorcet winner, you have a tiebreaker. So you pick the nearest miss to a Condorcet winner, right? So somebody who's almost a Condorcet winner, but not quite. And there are different ways of defining what that means. And there's a lot of argument about how to do the tiebreaker and so on. But nevertheless, there's for example a theorem that was proved by a guy called Hervé Moulin, who's a French economist who's actually now at the University of Glasgow and in the business school, and he proved that any Condorcet method has what's called the no-show paradox, which means that it's sometimes, when you've got at least 4 candidates, it's got the no-show paradox, which means that you can sometimes benefit your preferred candidate by not bothering to vote. right? So your candidate's actually made worse off by you showing up and voting for them. Right? So you can't have a Condor system that doesn't have that property. I mean, it's horrible, absolutely horrible. So basically, there's a kind of pessimism in the literature about all these ranked methods. You can even find books. You can even find people saying quite exaggerated things, like in my view, that democracy is impossible, that it's all hopeless. Then the most you can hope for is that you've got the right to throw out a government if it's really awful, but you shouldn't in any sense try and think that the winner of an election is supposed to be chosen in some scientific way from the preferences of the population. But that's in my view too pessimistic. But the way that people get to this pessimism is by taking note of these theorems, that the very bad way in which preferences aggregate. They don't aggregate in a well-behaved way.
A question I had for you, Adam, is should we completely rule out undemocratic processes as a way of achieving social preference?
Well, I guess you can ask two slightly different questions. I mean, one is, what's so great about democracy? And I think, it needs to be asked, I think, and answered. And the political scientists have answers. But I mean, there's a guy called Jason Brennan, who's an American philosopher, I think primarily, who's written a book, I think it's called Against Democracy or something like that, sort of reviving very old ideas that go back to Plato, that maybe, you shouldn't just let the masses decide. You should have experts of some sort. Anyway, if you look at what's happened in some places recently when they are allowed to vote, the general population, you might think there is something in this, but obviously it's highly controversial to say the least. I mean, the way you put it was as a way of social choice. I mean, I suppose, if you think that democracy leads to bad results, I suppose you'd be saying actually people don't know what's good for them, right? I mean, it'd be like letting the children decide on their bedtime, right? That's kind of the idea, I guess. But I guess the aim would still be, to benefit society as a whole. I guess you might also just be a dictator that was quite happy to run things, for yourself and your family or something. But, maybe people are not expert enough. I mean, it's not, I think his point of view is not mad, right? I mean, maybe it's rather hard to know. And people were saying, I think with Brexit, I think I read somewhere that, again, it's enough to make you weep really, but the morning after the referendum result, people were Googling what is the EU, having voted to leave, They were Googling to find out what they'd voted for. And the people were saying, I don't know enough about the EU and, what it does for us, to know which way to vote. On the other hand, who does know enough and how much do you need to know to make a really good judgment in these circumstances? And I guess most people would say it's, the expert argument is overridden by the danger that some if you did restrict the franchise to an elite group, that they might run things in their own interests. So I suppose democracy is some kind of check on that. But I think these are good questions, certainly.
So it's not sounding great in terms of the systems that we've discussed so far. So do you have any of your own ideas about the best voting methods, or any methods that you think are particularly promising?
Yes, so my own interest. I mean, I think this pessimism is not really justified. Preferences are completely dominant in the literature, but I think really for bad reasons. The system that I call range voting, where rather than just say number 1, number 2, number 3, you give candidates scores out of 10, let's say. It's informationally more rich. So one reason for going from an X in the box to preferences is because you get more information that way, and you can push that further and say, well, if I get scores, I've got not just a ranking, but I've got a sort of strength of preference. So all preference systems, in a way, this is the problem. All preference systems, they're not sensitive to strength of preference. So I can prefer A to B to C, but that might be because I think A is a tiny bit better than B, and both those are miles better than C, and I really hate C. Or it might be because I think A is fantastic, and I think B and C are both absolutely awful, but B is just a tiny bit less awful than C, right? And both those give the same ordering. It's A, B, C in each case. but with different strengths. And if you have a scoring system, you can express that, because you can rank them, say, 10, 9, 1 in the first case, and 10, 2, 1 in the second case, something like that. And it turns out there's a thing called range voting, where you just get each voter to score the candidates out of 10, let's say, and then the candidate with the highest average wins. And it turns out that those things do not have the same sort of pathologies in terms of cycles and if A beats B and B beats C, you'll never get C beating A in this sort of case, because they're just numbers. Numbers behave well. Okay, they're just averages. So that's the way I would hope to go, is some kind of range voting. And in my own interest, I mean, you can do other things with the numbers, and that's what I'm interested in myself. That once you've got these numbers, you can interpret them in different ways, and you can do different things with them. And I've invented a weird system that doesn't take the average, but does something else with the numbers, and I've tried to argue that that's superior.
It still seems though like the issue of tactical voting would come up.
Yeah, I was about to...
Yeah.
This feels particularly susceptible to manipulating it, so you can always get...
Yeah, good. Yes, no, look, so the first thing to say is, I mean, tactical voting is a big elephant in the room. I think I mentioned hardly at all. It's a problem. There's a theorem that says that basically any preference system satisfying certain weak criteria is susceptible to it. There's one quite nice system, actually, that isn't, which I just mentioned in passing, which is it sounds mad, but actually it's quite a good system, which is vote as now, first past the post, put an X in the box, and then rather than count the number of votes, pick out a ballot paper at random from the ballot box, and whoever that voter has voted for is the winner. And that's one of the very few systems that where there's no incentive to vote tactically. Of course, it might on a bad day produce a really weird parliament, but it's not very likely, actually, if you've got enough seats. Anyway, I mentioned that in passing, but there's a theorem that basically says that apart from ones like that involve random processes, basically all preference systems are susceptible to people voting dishonestly in order to manipulate the winner. And range voting, as you say, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, that's also susceptible to tactical voting, is the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is, given that all systems more or less are vulnerable to this, the question then is, well, which systems are less vulnerable to it? And it tends to be ones where it's less obvious what to do. And you might think range voting is bad from this point of view, in that it's rather obvious what to do. So you basically, I suppose that the thought was, if they think there's going to be very close between A and B, and they do definitely prefer A to B, then there's an incentive to mark B down artificially. And if you're really sure that it's going to be between A and B, I think that is a temptation, undoubtedly. If there's another candidate, I mean, the risk is, that maybe some other candidate, C, who you really hate, does unexpectedly well. And then if you've given B and C both 0 out of 10, then you haven't expressed the fact that you greatly prefer B to C. So I think that is a problem, and I mean, there are various suggestions of what to do about this. So one is something called approval voting, which is kind of limited in case of range voting, where you have to give every candidate either 10 out of 10 or 0 out of 10. Because the suggestion is that's what people would do anyway. They'll either give 10 or they'll give 0, because there's no point being wishy-washy. You may as well decide which ones you think are okay and which ones are not. Or equivalently, you could, because basically it's either 1 or it might as well be 1 or 0. You can just have ordinary ballot papers, put X in the box, and just say to people you can vote for as many candidates as you like. So just if you really want to vote Green, but you don't hate the SNP, let's say, you can vote Green and SNP, right? And that's fine. And then you just count number of votes, and the one with the most votes wins. That's not terrible, actually.
I think it's interesting because in the examples you've given so far, it seems like the voting system you choose has a pretty massive impact on the outcome of the vote. And so that sort of makes it clear the real world importance of picking a good system. And I remember we were talking before, you mentioned the Electoral college system in America and how that can lead to some pretty weird outcomes. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, you're absolutely right. It does really matter. I mean, you can hardly think of something that is more significant. And I mean, the US presidential election. I mean, that's obviously enormously important. And we've had I think, either the wrong winner or near miss wrong winner on several recent occasions. So in a way, I think that, 2016 is perhaps the most famous example, but I think it's too quick to say Hillary Clinton got more votes than Trump and therefore she should have won, because, as I say, that's just approaching it with a first past the post mentality. And we know there are problems first past the post. There were some minor candidates, and there was a libertarian in 2016 who got, I think, about 4%. I forget exactly, but fairly significant number of votes, 3%, something like that. And there was a green as well. So you have to think, well, if they'd had, let's say, a AV system or something like that, some system that took account of second preferences for those minor candidates, where would those have gone? And so I did look at it once, and I think I decided Hillary would just have scraped home, probably. Because the problem is that even though Hillary got more votes than Trump, you'd think that probably a majority of libertarian votes might have transferred to Trump rather than to Clinton. So, but on the other hand, the Greens is the other way around. The Greens would probably have gone to Clinton. So I think she'd have scraped home. But in a way, basically, that there aren't third parties in the US in the sense that there are in most countries. So I think America would be the one country where having first past the post would be an improvement.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Thoughts. If you'd like to make a donation to support Thoughts, please check out the links in our social media bios. Remember, you can find us on Facebook at ThoughtsUFG and on Twitter and Instagram at Thoughts_UFG. See you next time.